Non-disclosure agreements and hush money payments in exchange for people's silence have become all too common staples in the modern evangelical church today. Or maybe more aptly put, the evangelical industrial complex. Many large and successful churches today have taken so much from the business world that today they can't tell the difference between where the church ends and where the business begins. Worst of all, some churches take toxic tools like NDAs to even darker places than the business world ever does. Even the secular world has made broad and silencing NDAs illegal in the past year. Yet, the church has doubled down and is still using them, all the while hiding behind things like the separation of church and state. So it's time that we talk about one of the best kept and darkest secrets in the church world, the use of NDAs and hush money payments to silence abuse. So it's time that we talked about one of the best kept and darkest secrets in the modern evangelical church. It's time the church returned to being above reproach instead of hiding from reproach. It's time the church stopped mimicking business and started acting like Jesus again. And that's exactly what we're talking about in this episode. So if you're ready for episode 2 of The Secrets Churches Keep, let's dive in together. Welcome back to part 2 of our docuseries on the secrets that churches keep. Last episode, we took an in-depth look at NDAs, where they come from, what they were originally for, and how they've become so misused over the last few decades, not just in business, but especially in the church. We also looked together at a National Labor Relations Board ruling that made these kind of toxic and silencing, overly broad NDAs illegal in order to stop businesses from covering up abuse and bad behavior. But we also saw how churches have used legal exemptions to keep using these illegal NDAs for often nefarious purposes. We also heard from both secular and Christian attorneys on their thoughts about NDAs and the dangers that they pose in churches today. And to close out last episode, we talked about some specific churches, some big time and well-known churches and other Christian organizations that have been known to use NDAs, hush money, and the silencing tactics we've been talking about to cover up troublesome behavior in their own backyards. And hey, if you missed that episode, you can check out episode 1 here and get all caught up. But today we're going to talk about why churches use NDAs. And we're also going to ask the question, should churches ever use NDAs? Is there a good time or a good reason for a church to use NDAs? We're also going to break down the leading arguments both for and against the use of NDAs in the church. And we're going to do that from both secular and Christian perspectives so you can get a really good view of how people feel about these NDAs. And surprisingly, more people agree on how NDAs should be used in the church than not. And don't forget, in episode 3 of this series that's still upcoming, we're going to be breaking down some real world NDAs, and we're going to be showing you exactly how these have been used by churches so that you can see the red flags, you can see the tactics they use to hide bribery and to silence people. We're also going to show you through that the deeply damaging effects that has on people when they sign these that most of us would never realize until we've actually seen how they're used and misused in the name of Jesus. All right, so let's start with why in the world do churches use NDAs in the first place? Now, this is a fairly new phenomenon. In last episode, we talked about the fact that NDA use didn't really start until the 1980s, and that was in the tech industry. But now, fast forward a few decades, and NDAs have been used all over, widespread, to cover up abuse, to cover up other tactics way outside of what they were created for, which was trade secrets and to cover up, standard business practices, right? So how did we go from protecting trade secrets from tech firms in the 1980s and 90s to non-disclosure agreements being used in the church to keep people quiet about things that they may see or know that could embarrass a church or could cause some leaders to be removed from churches? How in the world did we get here? And more importantly, why did we get here? So let's talk about a few reasons why churches use NDAs. And these are reasons that I've heard straight from the horse's mouth, straight from pastors in large evangelical churches, right? One of the biggest reasons that churches use NDAs is for control. Plain and simply, it's for control because they want to control the narrative. That's a phrase that I've heard so many times, guys, it makes me sick. But I can't tell you how many church leaders will say things like that. It's important that we control the narrative around X, Y, or Z. When you have a staff member who leaves abruptly, they want to make sure they control the narrative about why that staff member left. And that's why you hear so many staff members in churches that they leave abruptly, yet they left because they felt God was calling them to a new place or a new season of ministry. And they want to be obedient to follow God's leading. And you may hear that and think, now, wow, I was just with that staff member last week and they seemed pretty bought into what was going on here. Well, the reason you may be thinking that is oftentimes they were bought in to where they were. They were bought into the ministry they were doing. God didn't call them anywhere else until they were fired. But if a church tells you, hey, we fired this person, they know people are going to ask questions. And when you ask questions, you're going to have to give reasons why. And oftentimes, the reasons why people are fired at these churches is over things like, well, the numbers weren't high enough, or this wasn't happening, or they didn't get along with this specific person in leadership. Sometimes they can be valid. A lot of times they're silly, but almost every time when churches use NDAs, the number one reason is they want to control the narrative. They want to control how people think about that situation. They want to tie a nice bow on it. They want to make everybody feel good about it, but they also want to control what the other person says. So it's one thing if they have a nice story cooked up, but if that person's not willing to go along with it, if that staff member's not willing to lie on their way out, then it's going to cause more problems than if they hadn't signed the NDA or came up with a nice narrative to begin with. So how do churches control what these people, these staff members, and this is a story, an example about staff members, but remember, NDAs go to volunteers and sometimes regular church members as well. But how do we get them to tell the story we want them to tell? Well, we offer them an NDA right after they've been fired, most of the time, right after they've been let go. And what we do is we offer them that NDA with a severance payment. So if they don't take that severance payment, if they don't take that hush money consideration, then they're asking questions like, how am I going to pay for my insurance? How am I going to take care of my family? How am I going to pay my bills? What's going to happen while I look for another job unexpectedly? So people will sign these NDAs, take that hush money payment because they're scared, they're fearful, they're caught off guard. But here's what the NDA says. Now, you can't say anything that would embarrass our church. You have to tell our story. Because if you tell anything other than our story, and this is more implied than written, but because it's written in the NDA that you can't say anything to embarrass the church, then if you say anything other than the narrative that the church has chosen, then at that moment, you're actually in breach of the NDA because you've embarrassed them. You told a story they didn't want to tell. So this is how they control not just the narrative around the staff's departure, it's how they control what that staff says. But in most of these NDAs, they last for a lifetime. Some of them, as you're going to see when we break them down, they last beyond a person's lifetime and they extend to more than just the person who signed them. So when you do this, the person who signed the NDA is now muzzled for the rest of their life. But as months pass, as days and weeks and months and years pass, the narrative that the church tells will slowly change and often will slowly morph until eventually things have been implied, things have been said, things have been done to where now a few years later, people no longer have fond memories of that staff member, but they actually think, you know what, that staff member, the church was just trying to honor them on their way out, but they were really involved in some bad things or some nefarious things, or they just couldn't cut it, or they had made mistakes and the church had to get rid of them even though they didn't want to. And guys, I have heard this more times than I can count, where people signed the NDA, they took the money, they told the story the church wanted to be told, it made the church look good in the moment, only to find out months and years later that their character had been destroyed. Their character, their reputation had been assassinated slowly but surely by that church. But here's the thing, NDAs control what the person leaving, what the person who signed them says, but it doesn't say anything most of the time about what the church leaders who are still there actually have to say about you. Right? So they can destroy your reputation afterwards slowly in a controlled way that makes them look great, makes you look terrible. So if you're at a church that has a lot of staff turnover, and you've wondered, why are so many staff members leaving on a regular basis, but all you ever hear are good stories about how God called them somewhere else, that could be a huge red flag that NDAs are being used. And the last part of control leads us to the next reason why churches use NDAs, and that's actually to cover up abuse, to cover up sometimes crimes, financial impropriety, to cover up mistreatment of people, and sometimes it's not criminal. Oftentimes it's just to cover up something that, even though it's not criminal, if church members found out about, or if the community found out about, they would no longer respect that pastor, or that pastor, that leader, may not be fit biblically for ministry anymore if the things that certain people know come out. Now, again, cover-ups are just another form of control. We've got to control what gets out. We got to control how it's said. We got to control what needs to stay secret so that we can protect the reputations of people, right? So sometimes they'll actually fire the people who did wrong things, but they want to cover up that wrong things were done. They want to cover up that sin was involved because they want to make the church looks good, right? Another reason why churches use NDAs is to protect the brand. You heard that right, to protect the brand. Many of these large churches and church leaders who are using NDAs, they think of their church so much like a business that they think of their church as a brand. We got to protect the brand of X church. We've got to protect the brand of Y church, because if we don't protect the brand, people are going to think something different about our church than we want them to think. So a lot of these seeker-sensitive churches that want people to believe they love the community, they're a welcome place for everybody, they're full of grace, it would hurt the brand to know how often they fire people for next to no reason. It would hurt the brand if people coming into the church knew how high the volunteer turnover was. It would hurt the brand if people coming into that church knew that there had been impropriety or abuse allegations from church members, right? All of those things can hurt the brand. And while, yes, they do hurt the brand of the church, Jesus didn't call churches to have brands. He didn't call you to protect the brand of your church. Jesus called churches to protect the sheep and to advance the gospel and to make disciples. So if you're more worried as a church leader about the brand of your church than you are the people of your church, then you're not fit to be a church leader anymore. And you need to get out and give that to someone else who is called to people and cares for people. But again, I can't tell you how often I've heard people talk about using these NDAs to protect the brand. When you get to the heart of the matter, though, protecting the brand is usually not as big of a deal as protecting the reputations of certain individuals in the church. Protecting the reputation of that charismatic, well-spoken senior leader, or protecting the reputation of that executive leader that's been around for so long. Oftentimes, the reason why churches use these ironclad NDAs is to protect the reputations of leaders that they care about, that they want to look good when they've made mistakes. Now, I'm all for people being restored. I'm all for grace. I'm all forgiveness when people make mistakes. What I'm not for, though, is leaving people in pastoral and church leadership positions who are actively involved in sin, not repentant, and haven't fixed it, okay? There's just a lot of mistakes, and I've spent most of my life as a pastor. There's a lot of mistakes that if I made as a pastor, I would no longer be qualified to lead a church, and I wouldn't be qualified to do ministry at least for a long while, okay? But to protect people's reputations, to protect the golden goose senior leader at the top who is bringing in money to the church, who's bringing in people to the church, who's bringing in acclaim to the church, we often will use these NDAs to cover up what happened, protect a person's reputation, a leader's reputation, in the name of protecting the brand, so that we don't actually have to hold them accountable. We don't have to change anything, and we can forgive them and move on from whatever sin they committed without actually having to remove them. The problem is, if people aren't held accountable, and at times, if they're not removed, then they get bolder and bolder and bolder. And what starts out as small sin issues can grow into massive abuses before it's over if we keep covering things up. Now, I got a couple more. The second to last one that I hear often from church leaders, especially when I'm in backdoor, kind of have been in consulting roles over the years, when I've been on staff over the years. One of the last reasons that I hear for this is to protect God's reputation. Right? And you're going to hear this in episode 3 when we break down in detail some of the things that Pastor Albert Tate said about his church's use of NDAs. We got a ton of stuff we're going to break down from a town hall meeting that he was a part of. But this is one of the reasonings that they use. It's to protect God's reputation. Because if we say, hey, it's to protect someone in our church's reputation, that sounds bad. But when we talk about protecting God's reputation, it sounds way better. They may say it like this, and this is very similar to what you're going to hear when we hear from Albert Tate in episode 3, but it's things like, hey, sinners go here, people come here who are coming to find Jesus, and we don't want to let anything out that would keep people from coming to know Jesus, because that hurts the church, that hurts the reputation of Jesus when we have these disagreements or when anything bad becomes public, because people think that's what all churches are like. And I actually would disagree. I actually would say what hurts the reputation of Jesus the most from the church is when we cover up bad things instead of actually addressing them. But here's the last reason that I hear that churches say they use NDAs. It is to keep damning and damaging information from coming to light. It's when they want to keep damning and damaging information from coming to light. This is very similar to when we talked about the cover-up earlier, but whether it's from an individual, whether it's from the church, whether it was on purpose or whether it was on accident, okay? Sometimes these things are by accident, but a lot of times these NDAs are used because we want to make sure that nothing gets out that could damage the church, could damage the reputation of the church, could hurt the way we're seen in the community. So we want to keep certain things from coming to light, but also as it goes along, a lot of these churches start using NDAs all the time just so they don't get surprised by something they forgot to try to control, right? What they don't want more than anything at the end of the day, churches that use NDAs want to make sure that nothing is ever said, nothing ever comes to light that could cause them damage or could kind of damn their leadership or damage their position or the way they're thought of in the community. So that's the last reason, and it's another big reason why churches use NDAs. Now, you can decide for yourself. Did you feel like any of those reasons that I've heard from church leaders, did you feel like any of those reasons were good reasons? I didn't. Maybe you did. But what we're going to hear next, we're going to break down the specific arguments. And these aren't arguments behind closed doors, which is what I was talking about a minute ago. We're going to break down the specific arguments in public for why churches should use NDAs and why churches should not use NDAs. Hey, Church Disrupted community, if you've experienced religious trauma, church hurt, or spiritual abuse, and you want to heal and let go of your triggers and hurt, then we want to help. The Forgiveness Link and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association are two partners of the podcast that exist to help you leave your trauma behind and start living your best life. Church hurt and spiritual abuse don't have to hold you back anymore. Rob and the Forgiveness Link team will help you leave your trauma behind and experience massive healing in as little as 8 weeks. Their intensive process, it's faith-based, practical, and extremely powerful. I've experienced firsthand the transformative power of the Forgiveness Link process, and I would love to see you experience it as well. Dustin Stitt and the East Tennessee Mentorship team, they'll help you find healing from a different approach. This veteran-owned business is faith-informed and will walk through the healing journey at your own pace with you. From groups to individual sessions, they'll help you continue to take consistent steps forward toward the person that you want to be and the life that you want to live. Both partners can help you transform your life, and we believe in both of them. One is more clinical and delivers fast-paced results, and the other is more relational and works at the pace that you commit to. But please please, please, please don't stay hurting on your own. Your church hurt experiences, they don't have to define you, and they don't have to hold you back any longer. If you're ready to step into healing and leave your trauma behind, please reach out to one of our partners. You can find out more information about them in the description below or at disruptedchurch.church on the partners tab. Because since this has become so prevalent, even though we don't have a ton of NDAs to look at in the church, it has become prevalent in recent years. It has caused a firestorm with people asking questions about NDAs in the church. So we've actually had some church leaders, we've had lawyers, we've had people who have given reasons why, arguments for using NDAs, and many reasons for not. We want to give you both sides of those arguments, but just like this, I will break down some of those arguments when they don't make sense. But let's get into it. What are the arguments for using NDAs in the church? What are reasons that people will publicly say this is a good reason for a church to use an NDA? All right, so the number one argument for churches using NDAs centers around protecting people's private information. And we're going to talk about a bunch of nuances of this, but all of these kind of nuances, these are different ways of saying the same thing. We need to use NDAs to protect people's information. Protecting things like people's contact information, protecting things like information from counseling sessions, financial information and giving records, who gave what and how much when, and to protect database and passwords. And now most of these, again, these are very, very good. This is probably one of the best arguments for using an NDA or using a confidentiality agreement. But again, if you haven't watched episode 1, go back and look at it. If a church used NDAs that followed the National Labor Relations Board ruling, they could protect these things without having to use an ironclad NDA that forced people to lie, silence them. And you can use an NDA to protect all of these things: contact information, information from counseling sessions, financial information, database and passwords. You can protect all of those things without including a non-disparagement agreement, and you can protect all of those things without a severance, with no hush money involved. Actually, these kind of NDAs are best used up front, and you heard in the last episode, you're going to hear in the next episode, I'm not a big fan of NDAs up front because they're still misused. And when you have an NDA up front that's misused, it's more damaging than an NDA on the back end. But I will say, if the NDA is good, if it doesn't have non-disparagement provisions, if it's not for hush money, if it's not overly broad, doesn't silence people, it doesn't show any of the signs of bad NDAs that we talked about in episode 1, then you can have a very simple confidentiality agreement in your employee handbook or separate at the beginning of employment that simply says, for pastors or for even volunteers who are doing this, that says, I will not share contact information that I've gotten through the church's database. I won't share my passwords to any of the church's software or database. I will not share any giving information that I become privy to, and I will not share any information that comes from counseling sessions in pastoral counseling. Now, I've been at a lot of churches in my life that didn't do any of this, and that was still the expectation. We knew that it was part of the professional courtesy, it was part of the professional standards, which is, again, this is why denominations actually do help, because in denominations, there are oftentimes, more often than not, standards of conduct for professionals like there are in any other industry. In non-denominational evangelical churches, which use these NDAs at a higher clip than others, they don't have these professional standards, so they can fall back on potentially needing a confidentiality agreement. But I was taught in school, I was taught as a professional, you never share anything in counseling that was told to you unless it puts that person or someone else in physical danger, right? It's the same thing that's taught to therapists. That's what was taught to us, okay? I remember signing at one church. It was very simple. It was the only thing we had to sign, so it didn't raise any red flags. I simply had to sign a very small piece of paper the day that I was being onboarded as a new employee that said, I won't share any information publicly that I gather from any of our databases, okay? And that includes contact information, giving information, all of that. It's that simple. It was, I think, 3 lines, and it basically said that I wouldn't do that. But I will say the best argument for using NDAs in the church is to protect people's private information. But if you're using those kind of NDAs, it should be a very simple and very specific confidentiality agreement that doesn't include non-disparagement, doesn't include consideration other than this is what happens when you work here or volunteer here. To work here or volunteer here, you can't share these things that could be damaging to people. Now, the second reason that people publicly give for using NDAs in the church is out-of-court settlements. In the Church Times, Madeline Davies explains it this way. When it comes to NDAs and settlement agreements, typically involving a payment to an employee, the line is, it's arguable if this use of donated financial resources is reasonable. Madeline Davies says, I get that businesses do out-of-court settlements, and maybe it would be helpful for you to have an out-of-court settlement, with someone in church. But when you have an out-of-court settlement, you have to settle with money, and then it becomes a really, really big question. Okay, here's the first question. Madeline Davies does a great job of bringing this up. An out-of-court settlement, and that settlement money or severance money or hush money of any kind, is that a good use of donor funds? Think about it for yourself. The last time that you tithed or you gave a gift to a church, would you have given that gift if you knew that it could or would be used as hush money or for an out-of-court settlement? And I believe that if you're going to do any sort of out-of-court settlement from a nonprofit at all, that money should have to come from money that you had generated in some way, because nonprofits can generate some money. It just has to go back into the nonprofit, not to shareholders. But I think it should come from money you've generated as an organization and never from donor dollars. I don't think it's ever a good use of donor dollars. Now, you've also got to ask this question. If churches are going to court, why would they pay for a settlement? Usually, if you're paying for a settlement, it's because you have some fault there and you don't want to get this dragged through court. You don't want your name dragged through the mud. But if there's no fault there, you normally don't settle. Settling is an admission of some fault. So while I can see some situations where a church would get themselves into a lawsuit where they want to make it go away and they didn't do anything wrong, more often than not, when we're involved in these settlements, it's actually, again, it's just another cover-up. It's just a cover-up that made it to court. Christianity Today's Morgan Lee and Mark Galli, they actually did an interview on their podcast about this particular topic. And here's one of the things that was said on the podcast. When many churches face problems with misconduct, priority 1 isn't caring for the victim or rooting out the causes of misconduct. Instead, priority 1 is avoiding legal liability by locking up all evidence of organizational negligence. So the point of a private settlement is this: we're going to have this person leave the organization without litigation and save ourselves a lot of money. But again, you have to ask, does that sound like the church to you? Does that sound like something the church should be doing for you? He said, common practice with these NDAs and settlement agreements is that churches are more worried about this information getting out than they are about the victim. They're more worried about how it could affect their reputation than they are about people. So they give people money to stay silent so that they can look good. Again, this is one of the top arguments for using NDAs in the church. It just doesn't move the meter for me, okay? It doesn't move the needle at all for me, because as I think about that, it just sounds more and more like a reason not to use NDAs, okay? We talked about this one a little bit before, but this is, again, another one of the public reasons for using NDAs in the church. It's to keep unity in the church. And I'm going to put unity in quotes there because I don't believe that's real unity. If you have to hide the truth to keep unity in a church, I just don't believe it's real unity. We'll never hurt the unity of the church by telling the truth. We will only hurt people who are trying to hide the truth. But in a Blessing Point article, the writer actually says this: if you need NDAs to protect your church from division or dissension, the odds are that the fear of staff members speaking out is not actually your problem. Okay, I love that. And I've heard so many church leaders talk about this. We just want to protect against dissension or division. There are better ways to protect against dissension and division than using an NDA, okay? Good leadership and good pastoring would be the number one way to do that. I've left churches where I have disagreed with the pastors, I've disagreed with things that were going on. That's been the reason why I've left and even left staff. And I've never thought about actually talking publicly negatively about any of these churches until they started covering up things that were sinful, that was blatant mistreatment of people, and I knew they were covering it up with NDAs. So I don't think protecting the unity of the church, protecting against dissension and division is actually a very good argument. In a Church and Culture article, they actually talk about a specific use case of NDAs for this reason with the church. And they say it this way: one church facing a petition from current and former members to stop using NDAs responded on its website, "Some of our separation or termination agreements in the past asked employees to agree not to disparage or slander the reputation of the church, its directors, pastors, and staff, or any church members or attendees." It also states that the church agrees to abide by the same condition toward the staff member. The heart of this was to serve as a reminder for the church and the Christian employee to act like in a Christ-like manner, avoiding gossip and destructive slandering that causes division rather than unity. And again, we'll actually look at this specific church in more detail in episode 3, but I want to take a look at some of this stuff because this sounds good on the surface. But remember, this is a church where many members and former staff members, so church members and former staff members, found out they were using NDAs, made a petition to have them stop. And instead of stopping using NDAs or talking about it further, they just gave this kind of canned statement to try to shut people up. But here's the first thing that they said: we ask former staff members and employees to not disparage or slander the reputation of the church or anybody involved with it. Now, disparagement is anything that could embarrass the church. And when you see this in NDAs, you're going to see how sad it is. They are really just worried about being embarrassed. Slander and libel are totally different things. Slander and libel only happen when you say things that you know aren't true to damage someone. It's when you lie to damage someone. And oftentimes that's what gossip is. Gossip is I'm talking about something I can't corroborate. You don't need an NDA to protect against those. Why? Because there are already laws that protect against slander and libel. Okay? So if I just go start talking about a church or just start talking about a business and I say things that I know aren't true just to hurt them, okay, well, that's already against the law. There are already protections built into our U.S. legal system for that. You don't need to sign the agreement. So what this church just said, the only part of the thing that they said that would actually be needed is you could have a document. It would be the non-disparagement clause, which is, as we heard in episode 1 from Boz Savijan, a leading Christian attorney on NDAs and these sort of things. He said that's the most damaging, misused, and harmful part of the NDA. So the only reason they would need an NDA is for the harmful bad part, because there are already laws that protect against those things. And again, if you're telling the truth about something that happened, that is not causing division. That is holding people to account. All right, here's another reason, another argument for churches using NDAs. That's protecting proprietary business practices and information from competitors. This sounds really good on the surface because, again, this is what NDAs were created for, to protect, proprietary business information, to protect things from going from one business to another when an employee leaves and harming that business. But let me ask you this question: what competitors does the church have? Because biblically, other churches aren't our competitors. They're just other expressions and gatherings, part of the same body, part of the same family. And James Emery White thinks much the same way. He says this: there is simply no proprietary information that we would have to protect, or at least that we should want to protect. If a church has a breakthrough in terms of outreach strategy, why on earth or in heaven would you want to keep that from other churches? Why would you see another church's competition in the first place. And James Emery White again said that in a Church and Culture article. But if you have a breakthrough, wouldn't you want to share that with other churches? Why would a church ever see another church's competition? So if we don't have competition from other churches, then we're not protecting any trademarked proprietary information. Actually, probably the church that has the best argument for this doesn't use NDAs in this way. I don't know if they use NDAs or not. I've actually not heard one way or the other. But Life Church, led by Craig Groeschel, they're the makers of the Bible app. They've created the Church Online platform that the majority of churches use today. But all of those things, the Church Online platform, the use of the Bible app, everything they create as far as their sermon series, graphics, policies, all of that, they have a website called Open where they share that freely with churches all over the world. So the biggest church that has the most to protect as far as proprietary approaches gives it all away. Why? Because that's what the church is supposed to be. We don't actually have competitors. Another reason that we here is to protect leaders' reputations. And I would say instead of reputations, because we talked about reputations already, I think more often than not, this means to protect leaders' egos, right? Because a lot of these Christian leaders have really big egos. They don't want anything getting out that would make them look bad, that they would have to repent of, because that could be embarrassing. And again, you're going to see in some of these NDAs, they're actually giving language just to keep you from embarrassing them by sharing the truth. But let's talk about this phenomenon with protecting the reputation and egos of celebrity pastors. In a Religion News article, the writer says this: reliance on NDAs is entwined with the well-established phenomenon of celebrity pastors. When a church's identity is enmeshed with that of its celebrity leader, the church will often go to great lengths to protect the leader's image. Why does the church go to great lengths to protect the leader's image? Because how the church is perceived is enmeshed with how the leader is perceived. The church's identity can't be separated from the leader's identity when your church is built around a celebrity pastor. But they go on. In many of these cases, gossip is forbidden simply because of the leader's fragile ego, as if the leader can't bear the thought of anyone asking questions. Shouldn't we promote leaders whose psyche can handle critique? I love that last line. I love that question. It's so powerful. Shouldn't we promote leaders to being these senior leaders in churches, these senior pastors whose egos can actually handle reproach? She says critique. I would say reproach is the biblical word there, that a pastor must be above reproach. And you can't be above reproach if you're not willing to be reproached or to accept reproach. If a church leader needs NDAs and people lying and people in silence to protect their reputations, then I would say they're no longer fit to be in church leadership at all, and they should have already been removed. Okay? If they need silencing, they need hush money to protect their ego and reputation, they should already be removed. They're not fit for ministry anymore. Because again, you can't be above reproach if you're unwilling to accept reproach. So, hear me on this, and I'm going to be very clear and very bold. If any pastor or church leader who is knowingly using these documents and hush money payments to protect themselves, if you find a church leader who's doing that, they should be removed immediately. And in fact, they should have already been removed. And if you are a leader or a parishioner who is supporting leaders in churches who use these documents, NDAs, and hush money, then you are supporting them. And by supporting them in those NDAs, you are literally supporting abuse, the mistreatment of people, and lying. So anyone in the organization protecting leaders who know about these things or use these things, you have disqualified yourself from ministry. And I know it sounds harsh, guys. I know it probably sounds like I'm being too mean, I'm being too harsh, but I think it's time, and long past time, to clean house of these narcissistic and abusive leaders in the church. These narcissistic and abusive leaders who refuse any sort of accountability or any sort of correction They are not qualified for ministry, and we've got to get them out of our churches before they destroy them. Plain and simple, that's my take. Maybe it is too harsh, but I've seen way too much damage come from these fragile leaders and their fragile egos because they can't handle any sort of accountability. So that's it for the arguments for using NDAs in the church. Now let's check out the most common and most used arguments against using NDAs in the church. And again, these are public arguments against churches using NDAs. All right, the first argument against using NDAs in the church, and potentially one of the strongest arguments against using NDAs in the church, is a simple one, yet a powerful one. And it's this: NDAs deceive and mislead. That's what they do, and it's what, as they're currently being used, they're designed to do. It's the whole reason you give an NDA is to deceive and mislead. Maybe you're not deceiving or misleading the person who signs it, but you want them to sign it so you can deceive and mislead other people, like parishioners in the church or other employees in the church. And in an article, 10 Reasons Why NDAs Are Spiritual Abuse, that was written on the Roy's Report by Will Timmons. Okay, 10 Reasons Why Abuse NDAs Are an Offense to God is the title of the article. But he says this: the use of NDAs to conceal sin and promote self-righteousness deceives and misleads people. What is visible on the outside of the individual or organization is not a reflection of the inner reality. So at the end of the day, how does it deceive and mislead people? The NDAs require people to lie. What you see on the outside is not actually what's true of the inside. What you hear, the story you hear that's going on, is not the true story of what's going on, which means at the end of the day, these NDAs don't just deceive and mislead, but they promote us actively lying and telling untruths. Ann Pfeiffer put it this way: NDAs also have the effect of compelling lying. An employee who is dismissed as a whistleblower and subsequently bound by an NDA is prohibited from telling potential employers the reason for leaving her previous employment. Either she gives the standard line, "I can't talk about it," words that are a red flag that she's gagged by an NDA, or she has to give a lie or a fake answer. Now, here's the thing. This is what even Anne didn't realize as she wrote this. If this staff member is gagged by an NDA and they're asked by their future employee, "Why did you leave that company?" If they say, "I can't talk about it," that is, yes, a red flag that they're bound by an NDA, but it's also embarrassing and potentially disparaging to the church, which is why saying something as simple as "I can't talk about it" is actually disparagement and could be breaking your NDA. It could actually get this person sued. All right, the next argument against using NDAs is they cover up abuse. They don't just deceive and mislead. They don't just promote lying. They actively cover up abuse. And Ann Pfeiffer continues in the same article: the biggest complaint about NDAs is that they permit abusers to keep abusing. Why do they permit abusers to keep abusing? Because the abuse is hidden in the first place. So if no one knows about the abuse, no one is going to call the abuser to account on the abuse. And every time an abuser gets away with mistreating people, they're going to actually do it bigger and do it worse the next time. We are creating some of these monsters in ministry when we don't hold them accountable early. If we held them accountable early, maybe they could be restored. Maybe all could be forgiven. Maybe we could fix this before it becomes a big deal. But the longer an abuser gets away with abuse, the worse the abuse is going to get. All right, in a Church Leaders article by Stephanie Martin, she puts it this way: NDAs, or non-disclosure agreements, have been tied to many recent sexual abuse scandals, both within and outside the religious community. Jeff Robinson, he adds to it: the most common situation where an NDA may be used, to my knowledge, is where a Christian leader is being accused of an ungodly behavior, spiritual abuse, verbal abuse, bullying, dishonesty, manipulation, and the like by someone within their church or ministry. Spiritual abuse is far more widespread than most Christians think, and I'll agree to that. It is way more widespread than the average everyday Christian thinks, largely to these NDAs, but it continues, and the inappropriate solution of signing an NDA is also more common than most Christians think. And again, that's from Jeff Robson on the blog Every Thought Captive. The bottom line is spiritual abuse, all of these abuses, all of these cover-ups in the church are more common than any average believer would think, but that's also because NDAs are more common than the average believer would think. NDAs are directly tied to the cover-up of abuse and the continued sin and misbehavior in addition to abuse of Christian leaders. When we sign NDAs and we protect these leaders, they never get better, and the sin, the mistreatment of people only grows. A Relevant magazine article talked about it this way. So not only do NDAs keep victims from speaking out, they also keep them from finding their own freedom from past trauma. In all this, the only ones who benefit from an NDA are the institution, which gets a veil of secrecy, and the abuser, who knows public knowledge of what happened, can be contained. So what Relevant magazine says is, hey, there's a lot of people who have been through abuse. Maybe they haven't been through abuse, but they've been through religious trauma. They can't find mental health and emotional health freedom from that if they can't talk about it. So it keeps this person hurting and unhealed, keeps them in a damaged state. It keeps the church, the parishioners, in the dark, not knowing what's going on, not being able to protect people. It keeps an environment going for potential abuse with future parishioners and staff members. The only people that it helps, they said, is the institution it protects and the person it protects. Those two, the institution and the person, they're the only ones that benefit from it, and they're the ones that cause the hurt and damage in the first place. And a Roy's Report article, Julie Roy's writes it this way: NDAs have been increasingly used to muzzle people within evangelical churches and Christian organizations. They've been increasingly used to muzzle people. That's the word choice she uses, and I think it's a great word choice because that's what it does. NDAs muzzle people and keep them from telling the truth. She continues, they can also hide misconduct or suppress evidence and testimony, because NDAs all the way around promote abuse and cover-ups. So now let's get a little more practical and detailed about how these NDAs actually keep people from healing. Jeff Robson, again, he puts it this way: these NDAs, they silence victims with money in the form of severance pay, often serving as the unholy carrot. Sign this or you won't get paid. Where will that leave you and your family for the next few months? So it keeps victims from talking about what happened, keeps them from healing, because they have to make this choice right now between money to care for their family or to be able to process what happened, to be able to talk about it. And then in the article on the Roy's Report, 10 Reasons Why NDAs Are Abuse, they talk about it this way. These NDAs are often far-reaching, preventing victims from ever saying anything disparaging about the organization or individuals concerned, whether true or not. And again, that comes back to there are already laws in place to keep people from saying damaging things that aren't true. What is so damaging and keeps people from healing in these situations, they can't even share true things that happen to them that have caused them trauma, caused them harm, caused them pain. Right? So whether true or not, sometimes the NDA will prohibit victims from mentioning the existence of the NDA itself, shrouding even the existence of the secrets in secrecy. So if you can't talk about the NDA, you can't talk about anything that happened, and you can't talk about that even potentially with a therapist and sometimes your spouse, how are you going to heal? How are you going to move on? How are you going to process from what just happened? But that's not the only thing that NDAs do. Here's another argument against the use of NDAs. They avoid accountability. And we've already talked about this a little bit, but they avoid accountability. And in a recent Church and Culture article, they talked about it this way. What isn't well and good is when NDAs are used to protect leaders and organizations from bad behavior. What's even worse is when they are used for this purpose by churches. So when NDAs are used to protect people from accountability around bad behavior, that's already a toxic use of an NDA. When you add that use of an NDA into a church, where a church is protecting people from their own bad behavior and protecting people from the consequences of their bad behavior, it gets even worse. The Church and Culture article continues, yet that is what we are now learning has swept the church world. Think about that phrase. They said it swept the church world. You heard in episode 1, you hear again in this episode, you're going to see more in episode 3. NDAs have become commonplace in the evangelical industrial complex. They've become commonplace, not just in big mega churches, but I talked to a person just the other day who was at a church of under 200 people and had to sign an NDA when they left. This has become so much more common of a practice than anyone would believe. And that's what Church and Culture says. They says that's what we are learning. These NDAs have swept the church world. Scandal after scandal involving church and ministry leaders has revealed the extensive use of NDAs that had, until the dam broke, kept silent those who could have revealed the shadow life of the person or organization. And what they're talking about is in recent years, the dam has broke a little bit. There are people who signed these NDAs who finally got brave enough, came out, said we're going to talk anyway. One really high profile example, and we're going to hear more about Hillsong's use of NDAs in episode 3, but one very high profile example is Carl Lentz, who talked in a recent documentary about these things, including NDAs, and that he was under an NDA. So as we have people who have signed these NDAs come out, a lot of times as they come out and tell the truth about what happened, churches can sue them, but what we're finding out is a lot of times these churches won't sue them because that just makes them look worse. So you've had in recent years people coming out and talking about that. You've had in recent years people like my wife and I who have actually just exposed and said, hey, we refuse to sign this. Here's the NDA that's being used in the church. We don't think that's right. But even with the rise of voices who are talking about this, it is still shrouded in secrecy, and it is still very, very few people talking about it. So what do most Christians think? They think, well, some churches use NDAs, and that's crazy. They shouldn't do that. But my church probably doesn't use an NDA. At this point, we should almost assume that every church uses an NDA in the evangelical world until we've talked with them about it. And I don't mean you assume that they're bad, but go ahead and start asking questions, because many of our churches that we think would never do this are doing this and getting by with it. And even if it started out with a good heart and good motives, that can be twisted very quickly. So we've got to start having these conversations. Another argument against the use of NDAs is they allow abusers and poor leaders to continue mistreating people and getting by with it. Ann Pfeiffer writes it this way: there's something troubling about promising never to mention a person's bad behavior in exchange for money. This is, of course, how lawsuits are settled. Parties agree to this to avoid public trial where their own credibility and lifestyle will be challenged and exposed. Now, that's what Ann says. Of course, there's something troubling about this in the church. It's how lawsuits are settled. But we shouldn't operate in the church the same way that courts and mediators and attorneys operate with out-of-court settlements. Caitlin Beatty, who is the author of Celebrities for Jesus, she writes a lot about spiritual abuse, the celebrity culture in evangelical Christianity. She says this in another Church and Culture article: in many large churches and organizations, and again, this NDAs are not just at large churches and organizations. They're at churches and organizations of all sizes, but you're going to find them most misused in these large churches. In many large churches and organizations, NDAs have served to conceal truth and to protect the image of the top leaders, allowing them to continue harming others entrusted to their care. And telling the truth, she adds, isn't gossip or slander. I can't amen that enough. Telling the truth is never gossip. Telling the truth is never slander. And I have heard that so many times on social media as we put out these podcasts, as we're doing the work that we do. We'll have people, usually pastors or someone who works on a church staff, accuse us of gossiping, right? But telling the truth, sharing facts is never gossip. And we've got to be able to stand up and stand for the truth, not let bullies back us down with accusations of things like gossip. All right, so moving on to the next argument against NDAs, they perpetuate sin. They perpetuate sin. And David French puts it this way, right? In a recent article that he wrote, he says, non-disclosure agreements, especially in Christian ministries, are poisonous and enable additional abuse. That phrase, that hits heavy. I don't like the fact that it's true, but I think it's one of the most accurate ways I have heard to describe this. NDAs in Christian ministries are poisonous and enable additional abuse. Because again, we've already talked about this a little bit, but if people aren't talking about how they've been abused in the past and victims are silenced, those abusers are going to keep growing more confident, think they can get away with anything, and the systems are never going to be checked. There's never going to be accountability to make sure that those abusive situations don't keep happening. Yet another reason, another argument against the use of NDAs, they foster environments of continued abuse against new people who can't be warned. So not only do they allow for continued abuse, they foster environments where new people can be abused who could have been warned, but were not because of NDAs. Could you imagine getting a job at a church where you can fulfill your calling? It is your dream. You feel on top of the world. It feels like God is blessing you so much, only for you to have an experience that is like the nightmare of nightmares. You end up getting spiritually abused or sexually abused, or you just get mistreated. It doesn't look anything like Jesus. It's a toxic work environment all the way around with abusive leadership styles, right? Bullying leadership styles. And now you're devastated. What you thought was this dream job has turned into anything but. You leave under this shroud of secrecy and silence. You're not even sure what they're going to say to future employers. You're not sure if you're going to be able to stay into ministry. That feels bad enough. But what if when that happened, you find out they've been doing this for years, for decades, but nobody warned me because they signed the same NDA that I signed? It's one of the reasons why we don't believe in NDAs. It's one of the reasons why we didn't sign an NDA, is because at some point, if we don't warn people who are coming behind us, then how they're treated, it's on us a little bit. But we also know most people cannot go without that severance money. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And that vicious cycle continues and continues and continues. A Relevant Magazine article said this: men and women find themselves bound by expansive and open-ended NDAs. Again, these are NDAs we talked about in episode 1 that don't have end dates. They have very broad definitions of confidential and disparagement. So they're super open-ended, cause a ton of fear. But men and women find themselves bound by expansive and open-ended NDAs, leaving them unable to discuss what happened with anyone. Sometimes they watch their former abusers move on to other jobs and even other scandals, but are unable to say anything about it. When the story started breaking about Ravi Zacharias, which we talked about in episode 1, and Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Lori Ann Thompson couldn't talk about it because she was still bound by an NDA. She requested to be released from the NDA, and then even Ravi's estate refused to release her from that NDA because when more and more stuff started coming out, she wanted to be able to weigh in about her experience, which would have helped expedite the process of getting justice for these victims. Okay, but it says they can't alert new churches that they're hiring an abuser. They can't connect with other victims. Their clauses are often so vague that they're not sure if they can say anything at all. And I can tell you from hundreds and hundreds of conversations with different people who've signed the NDAs, this is one of the most damaging things about them. You watch the people who hurt you move on and continue to do the same things, and you can't say a word, because even saying the smallest thing, even the smallest hint of warning, could be breaking your NDA. Another argument against the use of NDAs in the church: they foster a culture of fear and intimidation. In the same Church and Culture article that we referenced earlier, it says this: in research for her book, Celebrities for Jesus, Caitlin Beatty spoke about a former employee of a Southern megachurch whose pastor has been criticized for lavish spending, prosperity theology, and an authoritarian leadership style. The employee told me that once they joined, there was an instant spirit of fear. Staff were expected to stand whenever the pastor entered the room, and once planned an event where the pastor came out on a red carpet to take photos with attendees. But of course, the employee had signed an NDA. There was no way for her to directly warn staff or attendees of what went on behind closed doors. I have been on staffs like this, not this same staff, but I've been on staffs like this where there was an instant spirit of fear and intimidation. I've even talked to some of my leaders about that. And guess what? It didn't go well for me, because when you spoke up, you basically got blacklisted, right? But that culture of fear and intimidation, it's too normal in the modern day evangelical church, where we had these authoritarian leaders who are just wielding their leadership to bully and bulldoze over people. Another argument against the use of NDAs in the church is they trade God's law for legal tactics that even the secular world sees as toxic. Reformation Chambers puts it this way: when a church has someone sign an NDA, regardless of the context, they are going through the legal system via an enforceable legal contract. And you're going to hear in episode 3, you're actually going to hear a pastor say this isn't even enforceable, which is a complete bold-faced lie, because it is quite clearly an enforceable legal contract. But it says they go through the legal system via this enforceable legal contract to maintain someone's silence. How can you bring a dispute to a wise person in the church when there is a legally binding gag order attached to one of the parties? And not only that, as we've seen through the rise and fall of Mars Hill, there is usually a financial stipulation attached. Either you sign this or you don't get any severance. Sign this or you don't get any severance. So instead of following God's law and God's process, the biblical process for dealing with accountability, for dealing with sin in the church, for dealing with arguments and frustrations and sin between brothers and sisters, we've traded that for taking the world's way. And not only taking the world's way, but we've taken the world's way, doubled down on it, and made it worse. And that gets us to the next argument as we talk about trading that silence for severance. That gets us to the next argument against NDAs in the church, and it's that they actually cause us to commit simony. Simony classically is defined as the procurement of spiritual power, privilege, or position by money. Not only does it cause us to commit simony, though, but these NDAs, they leave people with what I think is one of the most sinful and toxic choices that a church could ever put in front of a person. And that's choosing between caring for your family and telling the truth. What kind of a choice is that? How painful of a choice is that? Yet I've sat with many people who are faced with that choice, and I've been faced with that choice myself. Do we care for our family, or do we tell the truth? And no matter what choice you make, it is excruciating. According to the Roy's report, many who have signed NDAs did so under difficult circumstances, often with their families' livelihoods at stake. Think about the average salary of any sort of pastor, minister, church worker who's not a senior leader of a megachurch. We hear about all these big salaries, and we talked about that before on this podcast. But the reality is, the average church worker makes very little money and can't even afford to live in the same communities they do ministry in. I've worked at mega churches where the average salary for your everyday pastors was between $30,000 and $50,000, sometimes in communities where you couldn't even begin to live on that in those communities. So when you got these people who are working for the ministry, they're not making hardly any money, they're not able to hardly save at all, and then in the blink of an eye, they lose their job. Usually they don't see it coming at all because of the way churches do this, but now you're faced with this choice. You can have a few months of that salary and continue taking care of your family, or you can preserve your right to tell the truth and your family may not be able to put food on the table next week. And that's not even thinking about the insurance and everything else that comes with it. That is a deeply damaging and I think deeply sinful choice to put in front of people. But beyond that, another argument that you can make against NDAs is it's just plain weird to use NDAs in the church. The Warburg Watch explains it this way. It's also just a strange thing for a church to say, you're not allowed to disparage us as a condition of receiving this money we're going to give you. It's very weird. It doesn't line up with what we think of when we think about Jesus, and I just can't see a good reason for using these NDAs in churches. Yet another argument against NDAs in the church: NDAs cause more psychological damage to those who have already experienced trauma and keep them from processing it. This is a little bit different than what we talked about earlier. It doesn't just keep people from processing hurt, but this is when they've experienced trauma that's led to things like a spiritual PTSD. Well, now they can't get healing, and it's affecting everyday scenarios in their life. It's affecting everyday relationships. They may never be the same if they don't get help dealing with their trauma, especially when it's something like PTSD. And according to churchleaders.com, what the NDA does is bind the conscience. So if you think God's telling you that you really need to share this with someone, you can't do that. Think about that. You can't do what you thought God is calling you to do. Why? Because there's all sorts of legal repercussions. And some NDAs even prevent people from confiding in a Christian therapist, which this writer calls just appalling. Appalling. And I think that is because this can literally, with people who have been traumatized, especially before, if they layer trauma, real life trauma, especially in cases of like sexual abuse in the church, when they layer that trauma, if they don't get help, this could literally derail and change the rest of their lives. So you would think when you were hurt in a church, the church would care enough, even if the hurt was unavoidable, to make sure that you could heal and that you could be fully functional and fully healed and whole for the kingdom. Yet when we sign NDAs, it keeps people from healing, especially the ones that, again, don't allow you to talk to a therapist. I think the next argument against NDAs in the church is probably one of the best practical arguments outside of the silence and everything else. We've mentioned it, but I want to talk about it in a little bit more detail here. It's the argument that donor funds should never be used to pay out hush money payments. Nobody gives a donation to a church. Nobody gives tithes and offerings or to a special offering and thinks, you know what? I can't wait for this money to be used to advance the kingdom. And I'm sure the way they're going to use this to advance the kingdom is with an NDA to silence one of these staff members that I love. Why would we have to silence staff members that God called here? And if God's calling them away, if God called them here and he called them away and we've been above reproach, there's no reason to silence them. I think most of us who give money to the church would be absolutely sick to know that sometimes the money that we give is used to force NDAs and hush money payments on people that we love on staff to keep them silent as we get rid of them. I think that would make most of us not just sick, I think it's heartbreaking, because sometimes it's the people we love most on these church staffs, and our donations are playing a role in silencing them and in basically kicking them out the church door, sometimes for no reason other than they disagreed with something leadership was doing, or they called to account something wrong that they saw was going on. I can't fathom any donor who's giving to a church and says, I am okay with this money being used for NDAs. So again, I think if a church is going to use NDAs, it should be illegal for them to use donor funds for that. There needs to be at least another way that they're raising money, because donor funds should never, in my opinion, be used for hush money payments. But I also want to take a look at one of Rick Warren, famous pastor of Saddleback Church in California. I want to take a look at one of his arguments against NDAs, because years ago, he explained why Saddleback didn't use NDAs. Now, if you watched episode 1, and if you haven't, go ahead and catch up on that episode. But if you watched episode 1, we talked about Andy Wood, the pastor who succeeded Rick Warren at Saddleback, and how his former church, Echo Church, used NDAs to silence employees, how employees had petitioned Echo to let them out of those NDAs so that they could talk about some of the allegations of abusive leadership that they had seen out of Andy Wood. Now, Echo did not release any of those people from their NDAs. Andy Wood ended up taking over the pastoral role at Saddleback, taking over for Rick Warren. And all we know is that an internal investigation from Saddleback said, hey, there wasn't an abuse of leadership. We don't know that that was independent, just internal. And there's a big difference between an internal investigation, which says, hey, we investigated and we'll tell you what happened, versus an independent investigation with people who can investigate these things and have no horse in the race. But we know that Andy Wood has used NDAs in the past. We don't know if he's still using them at Saddleback today, but here's what we know. Rick Warren, the pastor who he succeeded, was pretty against NDAs. And here was his argument. This was in 2019. It wasn't this long ago. But in 2019, in a Religion News article written by Caitlin Beatty, it says, Pastor Rick Warren told a reporter why Saddleback Church, one of the most dynamic megachurches worldwide, didn't use non-disclosure agreements. He said it this way: we believe that our competition is not other churches, but rather our competition is the world, the flesh, and the devil. So even Rick Warren, who's been succeeded by a pastor who uses NDAs, said just a few years ago, we don't use NDAs because the only valid reason for using an NDA, here's what's implied in his comment, the only valid reason for using an NDA is to protect trade secrets and to protect, business information from your competitors. And as Rick Warren said, we're a church. We don't have any competitors. Our competition is the flesh, the devil, the world. It's not other churches. So why would we have NDAs to keep information from our competition? And I love this as we finish out this section on the arguments against NDAs in the church. I love this quote from Caitlin Beatty in the same article. She says this about NDAs: if there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to fear. I'm going to say that again because I want this to resonate in the depths of your soul. If there's nothing to hide, then there's nothing to fear. And we only need NDAs, and we only need to fear what people would say if we don't silence them with a legal agreement, if there is sin in the camp that we want to remain hidden. So in my opinion, and I know this is not every time, but in my opinion, more often than not, the existence of an NDA is actually proof that there is sin hidden in the church. And as you're going to see in the next episode, though, in some NDAs, because most people are going to believe that. Most people are going to see that, hey, if there wasn't anything to hide, why would we use this NDA? You're going to see in next episode, some of these real life NDAs have clauses that say this NDA and severance payment is not an admission of guilt. They need to put that in there legally just to protect themselves in case they do get out. And even though it's not an admission of guilt, the bottom line, again, I love the way Caitlin Beatty says it. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to fear. And if there's nothing to hide, there's no reason at all for a church to use an NDA. So now that we've talked about a lot of arguments, both for and against the use of NDAs in the church, I want to take some time to look at what is the popular consensus, both the secular consensus and the Christian consensus, and we'll even look at the biblical consensus on this question: should we use NDAs in the church. You know my opinion. I have a lot of issues with NDAs in the church, but I want you to hear from others. What is the general consensus, again, in the secular world, the Christian world, and even from Scripture about this? You can look at these things, you can listen to these things, but then at the end of the day, we all have to make our own determination on this. But I do think it's important to know, how do most people who are in the know about these things feel about them? So what does the secular public say? The secular public overwhelmingly says no. There's no reason to use NDAs in the church. And one of the reasons why we know the secular public overwhelmingly says no is because there are literally new laws from the National Labor Relations Board in early 2023 that we talked about already that said, hey, this strips away people's rights, this mistreats people. So from a secular law perspective, this is illegal. And why? Because it has hurt so many people who stood up against it and said, this doesn't need to continue. But again, we mentioned this article earlier, but Harvard Business Review put out an article a few years ago that said, this was the headline, NDAs are out of control. And here's what needs to change. So the secular viewpoint and opinion is that NDAs had become toxic, they'd gotten out of control, and they were being used to hide crimes and abuse and things they were never created for in the secular world itself. So if the secular viewpoint is that NDAs that are written like this are wrong everywhere, they're wrong in the secular world, then I think the consensus is very clear. They would also be wrong in the church world, because the church is supposed to be better. We all, regardless of your belief system, whether you're a Christian or not, we all believe that the church at its best should be better. They should be setting a better example if they're going to practice what they preach. So the secular public, in my opinion, and from my research, overwhelmingly has said no to NDAs overall, as well as in the church. And again, the only people in secular public who are for the NDAs are those who have something to hide that is bound by an NDA. Because, of course, they've already paid the money and they don't want that information to get out. But let's take a deep dive look. What does the Christian public? These are Christian men and women, some of them attorneys, some of them abuse survivors, some of them pastors, some of them news reporters. But all of these people are Christians who are going to give their viewpoint on NDAs. And again, sadly, the majority of Christians still don't realize NDAs are used in the church. They don't know what they are, or they think they're definitely not used in their church. But I want to go through a mixture of articles and some videos where you're going to hear the Christian public, some of our leading kind of thought leaders who understand NDAs from a legal perspective, talking about their opinion on this. So let's start by getting the take of Reverend Dr. Dave Scalide in a Blessing Point article that was entitled, Speak No Evil, Should Churches Use Non-Disclosure Agreements? And he puts it this way, not everything about an NDA is bad. Used in a limited scope, NDAs can be beneficial. For example, if a staff member is privy to sensitive financial information, or is counseling parishioners. And we talked about these things in this episode and in episode 1. There are good things that can come from an NDA when done well. Now, of course, this is an NDA without broad language. This is an NDA without a non-disparagement clause. But there are good things, he says, about NDAs if they're just to protect the right things, even though, again, a lot of those things could be protected in other ways. But he continues this way. Yet for all the good of limited scope NDAs, they have often been used as a form of domination and keeping sin in the dark. News such as Willow Creek's and Ravi Zacharias Ministries' use of NDAs has suggested that NDAs helped suppress victims and perpetuate a culture of sin. So you have Dave Scalide who says, you know what? As a pastor, as a reverend, I can see some good things, some good uses with NDAs, but even for their good uses, the bad outweighs the good, and we've seen these consistently be used for bad things. So he's a solid no. And this is, again, from a pastor on NDAs. Let's look at pastor and author James Emery White. He gives us his take on NDAs. Let me be as clear as I know how to be, There is no place for NDAs in the life of a church. So James Emery White comes out swinging and says, hey, I'm not going to mince words at all. There is zero place for NDAs in a church of any kind. But he continues, I can think of only one reason why a church would use wide-ranging, all-encompassing non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements to keep people who work there or serve there silent about the things they might see or experience. And the only reason that you would want to keep a staff person or volunteer silent would be to protect the church or its leaders from being revealed for such things as sexually inappropriate or abusive behavior. Again, James Emery White minces no words. So that is two people who are well known in Christian culture so far who've said absolutely no to NDAs. Let's look kind of farther in the broader Christian world. The Archbishop of Canterbury gave his opinion this way: I have said many times that I am totally against NDAs. And he told that to Times Radio, and he added at the end, NDAs are unacceptable in churches. And that was the Church Times reporting from an interview with the Archbishop of Canterbury. Next, I want us to take a look and actually hear together from Scott McKnight. Scott is an author of many books, as well as a professor. He's written books like A Church Called Tove and Pivot most recently. He also does a lot of work with Grace. So I want you to hear some things he said about NDAs in his conversation with Boz Savigin. And that is the same conversation that we heard from Boz and Grace earlier on in episode 1. But let's hear, I'm going to share with you probably about 5 different clips where Scott gives you his opinion so you can hear directly from him about what he thinks of NDAs in the church. Let's listen together, and then we'll listen to what Boz Savigin has to say right after that. This is from a conversation the two had together recently for Grace.
This type of behavior hurts Jesus. It hurts the gospel. It hurts Christian witness profoundly. It hurts the church. It hurts everybody. It ultimately hurts our nation.
So in talking about NDAs, Scott McKnight says at the end of the day, NDAs, this practice of using them in the church, it hurts everybody, including our nation as a whole, because it erodes the way people feel about us. It erodes the reputation of the church. But at the end of the day, Scott can see no good coming from NDAs because in more situations than not, NDAs literally hurt everybody involved, even the people who think they're protected by the NDA, because it actually keeps them stuck in sin and keeps them from repenting and being able to experience the goodness that God wants to bring through that. It keeps them from getting better and just allows them to hurt more and more people, which is hurting themselves. So Scott's first take on NDAs, they hurt everybody, which is not a good thing, but he's not done. Let's listen a little further to what he has to say.
For me, another way of looking is it's an economic exploitation of someone,
Yes.
of the marginal, of the less advantaged, and not always, not every NDA involves someone who doesn't have any money, but they will lose their status, and that is connected to what they're doing.
All right, so the second thing that Scott says about NDAs is that more often than not, they're economic exploitation. They exploit people, ministers, pastors, church leaders, volunteers, victims who don't have a lot of money, and they exploit them economically, not having that money with a severance payout to keep them silent. Now, of course, Scott says that's not every situation, but more often than not, NDAs are a form of economic exploitation, basically manipulating people who don't have to keep secrets for money that they need. But he talks about it, doubles down in this next segment where he actually says that from his vantage point, NDAs are just bribery for money. That's really all they are.
In the end, to me, and I don't have a legal definition of this word, it's bribery at some level. It's bribing someone with money not to tell the truth. And this cannot be seen as a Christian moral act in any way, shape, or form.
So Scott says at the end of the day, NDAs are bribery for money. They bribe people for money to be silent. And what it ends up doing is it hides sin. And I love how clearly he puts it. It has no place in a Christian organization. It has no place in a church, hiding sin because of a bribe for money. And he continues talking about hiding sin for money in the next clip. Let's take a listen together.
In other words, it ends up hiding sin with money, because in most of these cases, someone doesn't want, let's say, someone with power. In many cases, it's been pastors, leaders in churches, doesn't want their reputation soiled or stained by something that they have done or said, could be almost criminal. They don't want this to be known because it could hurt their reputation. And they're more concerned about their reputation than living in the light and telling the truth.
So Scott says here, many times when these NDAs are used, it's because leaders are more concerned about their reputation than telling the truth. And that they hide this sin. They'll go to great lengths to hide sin, to bribe people with money to hide sin so that they can keep power. And we keep coming back to that from different people in the Christian community that we've heard from in these arguments against NDAs, that we're hearing from even now. We keep hearing that NDAs are about people keeping control and keeping power. But think about Christianity. That's not what Christianity is about at all. Christianity is about sacrificing those things and giving up power, giving up control as we follow Jesus. But Scott continues, and he finishes this in this last clip, but he talks about how many abuse cases have NDAs attached to them. And this is probably his biggest reason, as he finishes out, why he is a hard no on NDAs being used in the church, why he doesn't think they should be used in the church at all. And it's because of how many times they've been used to hide abuse. Let's listen together.
The first 16 months after that book appeared, we were hearing 3 to 5 stories a week from churches about power abuse. And a lot of these stories had NDAs connected to them where you couldn't talk.
So there, Scott's talking about his book release of A Church Called Tove. And he says, after we released that book, we were hearing story after story. We were hearing a lot of stories every day, every week about abusive situations, abuse of power, things like that. And he said, every time we heard a story basically about abuse in the church, more often than not, they were tied to NDAs. NDAs were part of the reason why that abuse was happening, because the abuse could only continue to happen because the abuse had been hidden. So that's Scott McKnight's take. You get to hear it directly from him about what he thinks about NDAs. In the same conversation, attorney Boz Savidjian, who is a Christian attorney and is the founder and one of the leaders of Grace Godly Response to abuse in Christian environments. And you get to hear from him. I love this because it's not just a Christian perspective, but it's an attorney's perspective who deals with these NDAs all the time. So he's going to see good, he's going to see bad. And I want you to hear 2 clips from Boz where he makes it very clear how he feels about NDAs in the church. So what's his take? Let's listen in.
A trade secret, that is to me legitimate grounds for a confidentiality provision. Quite frankly, you'd have to really convince me that you have a trade secret issue within a church environment, okay? I don't know. That I'm sure there becomes some argument, but that quite frankly just doesn't exist in a church environment.
All right, so you heard from Boz. From an attorney's perspective, he says protecting trade secrets is probably the most legitimate use. It is a legitimate use of NDAs. The problem, from his perspective, is that trade secrets and the need to protect them in the church doesn't exist. That churches don't have trade secrets, and anytime they do have something that could be considered a trade secret, that there's no way he can see that it shouldn't be shared with other churches or that it should be hidden. So if that's the only real legitimate use for NDAs, and it's what they were created for, then if there's no need to do that and protect trade secrets in the church, then that's going to be a no. That NDAs shouldn't generally be used in churches. But he goes a little further, and he's going to get real clear in this clip, telling you the way he perceives these NDAs and what they're actually doing, the way they're used in churches today. Let's hear it straight from him, though.
Final kind of confidentiality provision that I think a lot of people associate with an NDA is where you cannot talk about any of the facts that surround whatever this issue is. So whether it's a settlement agreement, and that, which means I can't talk about I can't even talk about the fact that there is a settlement agreement. I can't talk about the facts leading up to the claim that I'm making. Or if it's a separation agreement from employment, I'm agreeing not to talk about any of the facts related to what led me up to separate my employment with this church or this organization. That's really what I call a gag order. That's saying to somebody, you cannot share your story, whatever it was, whether it was being sexually abused at a church, whether it was being spiritually abused by church leaders. When you sign that agreement, you're signing away your ability to share that story.
So you heard it from Boz, straight from his mouth. From this Christian attorney's perspective, NDAs, the way they're used in the church today, they're gag orders. They're gag orders that muzzle and silence people from telling the truth, right? You pair that within the same conversation, Scott saying, hey, this is bribery for money, and it doesn't look good. So far, you've got out of, 4 Christian perspectives, 4 leading Christian perspectives we've looked at. It's a hard no from all of them on NDAs, except for if you can find a way to say that churches have trade secrets. Yeah, as Boz said that, he said, I see no way that could happen. And the only other concession was given was to protecting counseling information and financial information within a church. None of those things are what most of these NDAs are designed to do. And you don't need, again, a non-disparagement clause at all to make those happen. Diane Langberg, who's a psychologist, Christian psychologist, has done a lot of work in the Christian community around abuse and trauma and leadership and all those sorts of things. She actually says this in an article. She says, NDAs, this is an article on her website, NDAs cover ugly things. NDAs protect systems rather than precious humans made in the image of God. So far, she says NDAs protect ugly things and NDAs protect systems instead of people. And then the last thing she says, NDAs require deception for the sake of truth. None of those are good things. And in that blog article, she makes it very clear she doesn't think NDAs have any place in the church, but you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to go searching even for the blog. Let's hear what Diane's view of NDAs is directly from her in a conversation she was having about these things with other people, as well as Rachel Denhollander, who is an attorney we're going to hear from later, and an abuse survivor and abuse advocate. But let's hear from Diane Langberg first. What's her viewpoint on NDAs?
What's your view on the role and place of a non-disclosure agreement in Christian ministry, Diane?
Well, I find them very distressing. We say we follow the God of truth and the God of light. And an NDA basically says, shut up. That's its message. And if you don't, something bad will happen to you. So it is a terrific tool for getting people to be silent, which continues to cover up things that God hates.
All right, so there you hear it from Diane Langberg. She doesn't see a place for NDAs. She actually says NDAs have no place in the church because they're incongruent with what we say we believe in our Christian faith. They do things like hide sin that God is never for. But she continues, and in this clip, she's going to talk a little bit more about the damage that NDAs have on the church and victims of abuse.
I've worked with people who tried to get rid of them in their lives, who are victims, who can't tell their story without, who knows would rain down on them if they did, and things like that. I think the church is supposed to invite to the light, whether it's somebody on the pew or somebody in the pulpit. The church is supposed to call us to truth. And where it doesn't, it is not following Jesus Christ.
All right, so she finishes out there talking about the damage she's seen these NDAs do to real life clients of hers. People who can in no way talk about what's going on without major fears of repercussions and the way that the church might come after them. And as a psychologist, she knows that has done great damage, like we talked about earlier, to those people healing. And again, it's just as she continues to talk about NDAs seem, from her vantage point and from mine as well, to be incongruent with the Christian faith. And I want to finish with this quote from Diane Langberg, and I'm going to read this. I want to get it perfect. This is a quote from her blog. I think it's incredibly powerful, and there's no better way to say it than this. She says, "Tend the sheep, don't silence them. Tend the sheep, don't silence them." Because what are churches? What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to feed and care for the sheep, not silence them. We're supposed to protect the sheep, not tell the sheep to shut up and go away to protect ourselves. When we protect ourselves at the expense of other people, we've totally missed what it means to be called by God to be a pastor or to be in ministry. Next up, we're going to hear from Rachel Denhollander, and Rachel Denhollander was a part of the same conversation with Diane Langberg, but Rachel is also an attorney, so she understands these NDAs from a very unique vantage point, just like Boz Tavidjian. She's a Christian, and she was one of the abuse victims of Larry Nassar in the scandal at Michigan State. So she's been on all sides of this. She understands NDAs from the legal perspective. She also understands the damage of being silenced as a victim, and she understands faith. She's an avid churchgoer, someone who practices her faith. So she sees this from all sides. Let's listen to her take on NDAs, again, from the same conversation where we just heard from Diane Langberg.
As an attorney, this is a huge problem in Christendom. So much of the time what we hear with NDAs, well, we have to have this to not just protect the interest of our organization, to protect things that we have to legally protect. When you're dealing with a nonprofit, you have to protect things like donor lists and things that are patented or trademarked. There are certain things that by statute have to be protected. However, those things can be protected in the employment contract, in a termination or a severance package. Those things can be identified and protected in the contract without an accompanying NDA. You do not need an NDA to protect the things that you're legally required to protect as an organization. The NDA is well above and beyond and is usually focused on don't say anything bad about our organization. It is not necessary to have an NDA.
So you heard from Rachel, her first take on NDAs in the church is that they're unnecessary. You can protect all of the good things that have already been talked about. All of the good things to protect can be done without an NDA, without a non-disparagement clause, without the hush money or anything like that. It could be just a simple contract. Plus, there are a whole lot of other laws on the books. There's, professional expectations that would help do that as well. But she says not only are NDAs unnecessary, but many times they're used for something else completely. They're used to protect, again, that reputation of the church, to make sure that no one says anything that would embarrass the church, which is not helpful at all. And she started out by saying, as an attorney with her background, that this is a huge problem. It's a massive problem in churches today because, again, she knows from her work much more than I know or anybody watching this would know. Rachel and Boz, they see these way more often because the only person you can share that NDA with sometimes is your lawyer, is your attorney. So when an attorney, a Christian attorney, says this is a massive problem, that's something that we need to listen to. But she continues talking about the problem she sees with NDAs in this next clip.
Because it is such a tool that is used by institutions to silence survivors and to perpetuate this cycle of abuse when nobody can speak up, there's nothing you can do about it. And so they're not necessary. In some places, they're actually illegal.
So there you hear her talking about just the damage that this does in silencing abuse victims, not only to the victims, but to everybody else. And then she starts mentioning, and this is, she continues this after this clip, but she talks about how many states are at this point making these documents illegal. Talks about, things like the NLRB making these types of documents illegal. So again, now you've gotten a second Christian attorney who has said NDAs in the church, no bueno. They don't belong there. And all they actually are doing is causing problems. And at best, they're just unnecessary. Let's continue by hearing the take of Jeff Robson, a Christian author. What is he thinking about NDAs? We've heard a lot from him so far in this docuseries, but he says this: no Christian church or ministry should ever ask a Christian to sign a non-disclosure agreement or non-disparagement agreement or any other similar document to the same effect. He says using non-disclosure agreements is, it seems to me, a failure. A failure to properly protect victims, a failure to properly call sinners to account for their ungodly behavior, and a failure to trust the gospel to do its mighty reconciling work. That's strong words from Jeff Robson, but I wholeheartedly agree. Now, if we move on, in a Religion News Services article written by Donald Roth, Donald also shares his take on NDAs as he's writing for Religion News Services, says this: we have to face the fact that the existence of NDAs in Christian organizations is a worse witness for the church than any information that might come out in their absence. He also says this: to the extent that NDAs can be used to cloak systematic abuse, it is quite understandable that there is such a powerful public push to abandon them altogether. So that's another vote from someone in the Christian world against NDAs, and he also references the powerful public push that is also secular to abandon NDAs altogether. Relevant Magazine, a leading Christian magazine, talking about NDAs, here was where they landed. It's hard to make the case that churches should use NDAs. It's easy to see the appeal, but it's hard to see the biblical justification. And I love the honesty there. It's easy to see the appeal from a human side of wanting to protect anything bad or damaging or embarrassing from getting out about you, wanting to protect yourself when you made mistakes. But when you look at it from a biblical perspective, that doesn't make sense at all. So we've heard from Christian psychologists, we've heard from Christian attorneys, we've heard from pastors, we've heard from leading Christian authors, we've heard all the way around, and every single person has said some variation of NDAs emphatically don't belong in the church. They're doing more harm than good. They are doing more harm than good. But I want to finish this way. I want to finish this episode by taking a look at what the Bible actually says. Because what does it matter what the secular world says? What does it matter what other Christians, even well-known and well-educated Christians like Christian psychologists and Diane Langberg, or Christian attorneys and Boz Savigin or Rachel Denhollander, right? What does it matter what they say if we don't first look at what the Bible says? Does the Bible line up with what they say? Does the Bible line up with what I feel on this issue? And if it doesn't, then as Christians, we have to change our mind, because the Bible is where we go to first. So let's look at a little bit about what the Bible says around things that would surround NDAs. 1 Corinthians 6, 1-8, the Apostle Paul says, when one of you has a dispute with another believer, how dare you file a lawsuit and ask a secular court to decide the matter instead of taking it to other believers? Okay, so let's just stop right there. How dare you take this to a secular court, right? Well, isn't that what's going on here? This is when these NDAs are being used, it's a dispute of sorts, something you don't want to be said. And instead of talking about it man to man, woman to woman, man to woman, woman to man, brother and sister in Christ, we give you a legal document that would be enforced by secular courts to hold you silent. Well, isn't this what Paul is talking about? When one of you has a dispute with another believer, how dare you file a lawsuit and ask a secular court to decide the matter instead of taking it to other believers? And I know some people will say, Jeff, an NDA is not filing a lawsuit. No, it's not. But an NDA is a threat to file a lawsuit. If you don't stay silent, if you don't tell our narrative, we're going to file a lawsuit and we're going to go after you for damages. So if it starts with a threat of a lawsuit, it's already unbiblical. And I've had people use this passage to talk to me about, hey, we think this passage is why you and Church Disrupted shouldn't talk about issues in the church publicly, because we don't want to take those out in front of other unbelievers. But that's not really the same thing at all, because we're confronting issues with truth and saying, hey, we need to fix these things. We're not taking them to secular courts. We're being forced to talk about them in a public arena because of things like NDAs, because of that. And anytime that we talked about these things publicly, these are things that we went to churches privately to try to talk about in most cases, and we've been spurned and spurned and spurned time and time again because of things like NDAs. Now we have to, at times, bring public correction. But the same people who are using lawsuits and the threat of lawsuits to keep people silent will use this verse to try to keep people silent about the truth when they see abuse, sin. And in my opinion, that is a flagrant foul in the Christian community. But Paul continues, don't you realize that someday we believers will judge the world? And since you're going to judge the world, can't you even decide these little things among yourselves? Don't you realize that we will judge angels? So you should surely be able to resolve ordinary disputes in this life. If you have legal disputes about such matters, why go outside? Why go to outside judges who are not respected by the church? I am saying this to shame you. Powerful language by Paul. I am saying this to shame you. Isn't there anyone in all the church who is wise enough to decide these issues? But instead, one believer sues another right in front of unbelievers, or threatens to sue one another. Even to have such lawsuits, or I would say the threat of such lawsuits with one another, is a defeat for you. Why not just accept the injustice and leave it at that? Why not let yourselves be cheated? Instead, you yourselves are the ones who do wrong and even cheat your fellow believers. And I love that last part. Why not, Christian leaders, pastors, churches, why not just let yourselves be cheated? Oh, but wait. It's not about you being mistreated, cheated. It's not about many of these things being wrong. The truth is, you're the one. Paul says you're the ones who are cheating even your fellow believers. He says lawsuits are a defeat for you. He says shame on you when you try to fix these things and these disputes with lawsuits instead of being able to come together. So if we can't figure it out between brother and sister, if we can't figure it out between brother and sister of, hey, I'm bringing this issue to the pastor, we can't figure it out. I bring this issue to the elder board, we can't figure it out. That's why we have organizations like Grace that can provide independent investigations between Christian parties, independent investigations to say, here's what we found, and mediate those responses together. We should be able to do those sort of things rather than trying to keep people silenced by NDAs. But the Bible is very clear from Paul's perspective that lawsuits and the threat of lawsuits, they're not helpful. They're not biblical. And since you can't have an NDA that doesn't have a threat of a lawsuit, okay, if someone's not silent, then that's the first strike biblically against NDAs. But let's talk about, what does the Bible say about truth? Because the Bible has a lot to say about truth and honesty. We would be here all day if we looked at everything the Bible had to say about truth and honesty. But I want to give you some highlights of what Jesus and other biblical writers said about truth that's going to help us to see, do NDAs fit with this? So let's start in John 14:6. John 14:6. And Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. So let me ask you this question. If Jesus described himself as the way, the truth, and the life, one of the ways that he described himself was the truth, then how are we looking like Jesus or following Jesus, who is the truth, when we ask other Christian believers to sign a document that says they can't tell the truth? The answer is there's no way to follow the truth if we're asking other people to not tell the truth. John 8:32 says, and you will know the truth. And this is Jesus again. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Well, let me ask you this. How can the truth set you free if you're not allowed to tell it? Because when you sign an NDA, you're not allowed to tell the truth, which means that NDA is holding the person who signs it in bondage, because the truth can never set them free. Ephesians 4:25, the Apostle Paul put it this way, therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. So, hey, we're members of the same body. That's why it's important we speak truth with one another. It's why it's important that as members of the same body, we speak truth to a pastor who's in sin. But it's just as important why we speak truth to another member of the body who could go through the same effects of sin that we went through if it's not dealt with. So we can warn other people in the body about the mistakes that we've made or the sin that we've been through, the mistreatment that we've been through. NDAs don't allow us to speak truth to our brothers and sisters in ministry. It also doesn't allow us to speak truth to other potential future victims. So we keep going through the same cycle again and again and again. In John 4:24, Jesus said it this way: God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. How can we worship God in spirit and in truth if, again, we're not allowed to tell the truth? I believe these NDAs are literally hindering people's worship and hindering their relationship with God, because God calls us to be about truth, to tell the truth. And when we sign an NDA, we just can't do that. 3 John 1-4, John said it this way: I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. John said, I have no greater joy than to hear that my spiritual children in these churches are walking in the truth, which would lead me to believe that it would cause him grief to find out they're not walking in the truth. NDAs keep us from walking in the truth, and NDAs grieve the heart of God. They should grieve our hearts as well. 1 John 1:6, John says, if we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. If we say we have fellowship with God, yet we still walk in darkness or walk in falsehood as a part of darkness, then we lie and don't practice the truth. Saying we know Jesus and asking people to sign NDAs that withhold the truth or suppress the truth, when a person is doing that, we really have to ask the question, do they really know Jesus at all? Or is this just an act for them? Is this just a profession for them? So pastors, I'm telling you, if you're using NDAs at all, you need to get rid of them, because it's going to make people, when we look at it with a hard look, it's going to make people question your salvation and question if you're actively following Jesus while using these at the same time. Psalm 34:13. Let's look at some of the Old Testament. Psalm 34:13 says, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Well, deceit is not lying flat out. We talked about this in another podcast, but what deceit is concealing the truth of a matter. It's trying to, even though you don't technically lie, you are lying in earnest to someone. You're lying in practicality to someone because you're keeping them from truth that they need. That's what deceit is. Well, an NDA, when it says you can't say anything that might embarrass this church, that means that everything you say has to have a positive spin on it. And a positive spin always leads to deceit. Especially, it's deceitful and flat out lying when you have church leaders who made someone sign an NDA after being fired and then gets up and says in front of their congregation that, hey, this person was just called somewhere else. They're really excited about their next step in ministry. Let's pray for them. No, none of that was true. You fired them, you forced them out, and then you had them sign a legal agreement where they couldn't tell the truth. Then you got up and lied about it. That is not biblical. It's not God honoring. Proverbs 12:22, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. Lying lips are an abomination to God. There are a lot of Christians today who will talk about how, there are a lot of Christians from very specific conservative sects who will say that things like homosexuality and homosexuals are an abomination to God. But you know what they never seem to teach and what they never seem to talk about? That lying lips are an abomination to God. So how can we talk about other people's sin who are outside the church if as church leaders we're involved in an abominable sin before God of lying? Lying is doing way more damage. These NDAs are doing way more damage than anything anybody outside of the church is doing, right? Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. So how can we justify NDAs that make people lie? Proverbs 28:13, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses them and forsakes them will obtain mercy. Whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper. Black and white, simple, plain. What does an NDA do? I can't even speak. I'm getting a little hot under the collar about this because it's so unbiblical the way that we use NDAs. But what does an NDA do? It usually conceals someone's transgressions, poor leadership, power abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, inappropriate conduct, financial mismanagement, and the list could go on and on and on. Almost every NDA I've ever seen is concealing someone's transgressions. That will not prosper. It is not biblical. And I want to finish with my favorite verse on this subject. I think the verse that makes NDAs the clearest, it's Ephesians 5:11. So we'll hop back over to the New Testament. And I've had people again tell me time and time again since I started talking about these things publicly, Jeff, you're hurting the bride. You're doing damage to the bride of Christ and to the church by being honest. That's not what God's wanting you to do. And I always tell them, honesty is never a sin, and honesty never dishonors God. And here's how I know. Ephesians 5:11, Paul says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Have nothing to do, nothing with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them, bring them to light, talk about the things that need to be. When we look across the secular world, the broad consensus is that NDAs don't belong in the church. When we look across the Christian world, the overwhelming consensus is that NDAs have zero place in the church and they're only causing damage. And when we look to what the Bible says, the Bible's very clear that we should prioritize truth and that we shouldn't turn to legal lawsuits and things like that. NDAs don't fit the bill on any of that. NDAs are, from my vantage point, clearly unbiblical. So let's finish with this question on today's episode. Who says yes? If all of those people say no to NDAs, including attorneys, who says yes, NDAs should be used in religious spaces and in churches? And we're going to talk about this a little bit more. There are a couple of articles that says, in some places, maybe it could be used. But even those articles from Christian spaces say, but you know what? It's also been used for a lot of bad. So we got to be careful. The only people who unequivocally say, yes, let's fight for this. NDAs should be used in the church. NDAs do have a purpose in the church. It's the people who benefit from them. The people who benefit from the use of NDAs are the only ones who say, yes, they belong in the church and they are God honoring. So that's usually pastors, a few lawyers, and some select insurance agencies. Those are the only people who think that these NDAs are good and should be used in the church. Why? Because NDAs almost always hide something that should never be hidden, but instead should be exposed and should be brought to the light. So that's it for this episode. Do not miss episode number 3. Episode number 3 is my favorite because we're breaking down real life NDAs that have been used in the churches. We're going to look at them in depth so you can actually see these. We're going to hear more from Hillsong and about their use of NDAs. We're going to let you listen into a town hall meeting where Pastor Albert Tate tries to defend his use of NDAs, and what he ends up doing is lying on camera. But it shows you the tactics that so many church leaders will use to try to, use a little magic and a little, deception over here, getting you looking one way into another so that you think what they're doing is not really NDAs when it is. And you're even going to hear from a real life meeting with a church elder board, some of the church elder board, where they defend the use of NDAs, but they don't do a very good job of it. So we're going to look at all of that, and we're going to arm you to recognize NDAs even in places where they are hidden very well. And we're going to finish by giving you some resources from leading attorneys, leading Christians in these places on, hey, what can we do as Christians to begin to make a difference here? What can we do to limit or eliminate the use of NDAs in our churches? What can we do to try to pull this toxic practice out of churches so that we can all look and act a little bit more like Jesus, so that we can represent the kingdom well? That's going to be a phenomenal episode. I cannot wait to see you then. And of course, episode number 3 is going to be coming in a few weeks. We're going to take a couple of weeks break for the holidays, but look that first full week of January for episode number 3 of The Secrets That Churches Keep. And you're not going to want to miss this. This is going to answer a lot of the questions you've had about NDAs, and it is worth it just to see NDAs in the wild. And you're going to see they do exactly what we've talked about, and it may even be worse than the way we talked about it so far. But when we shine a light on these dark tactics and the ways that churches get by with this, when we shine a bright light on it, we just can't get by with this sin and this ridiculousness anymore. And when we do that, I think that pleases the heart of God and it protects the people that He's called us to serve. So I can't wait to see you in episode number 3 of The Secrets That Churches Keep.